Snow lay heavy across the Alder Ranch, the kind of winter that buried laughter and left only silence behind. Samuel Alder, a widower with one daughter, had once written a letter asking for kindness, but never sent it. And yet, one storm-torn evening, that very letter returned to him in the hands of a stranger who would change everything. From grief to hope, from an empty barn to a home reborn. This is how a quiet rancher and a weary traveler built a love story that the frontier would not forget. The cold came with teeth, and it bit deep. Samuel Alder rose before light because chores do not grieve. He coaxed flame from last night's coals, listened to the timbers pop, and counted what remained. One child, beans, 2 sound cows, a roof that mostly held. Rosie slept in the loft, breath steady. Since Mary died, survival was a list, not a feeling. The barn stood like a ship in ice, room for a life he no longer had. Above the tack hooks, tucked into a beam, rested the letter he never mailed, seeking a partner in decency, work shared, laughter welcomed. He had addressed it to an agency in Abilene and hidden it away. By noon, the storm arrived with a sheriff's authority, narrowing the world to the reach of his lantern. He tied a rope from the house to the barn and told Rosie it was a bridge. The wind couldn't break. She pressed her palm to the window as he stepped into the white. Toward dusk, the rope jerked, once, twice, as if the storm had hands. Samuel shouldered into the barn and felt the air held tight. "Hello?" A shape rose from the hay. Not a wolf. A woman. Cloak soaked, boots split, eyes steady despite the tremor in her hands. She lifted her palms. "I meant no harm. I needed a roof." He set the lantern on a peg. The light showed the tired arithmetic of her. Wet skirt, raw knuckles, grit and resolve. "You've found one." "Florence May," she said, and drew from her cloak a folded sheet in a waxed sleeve. "The agency stamp is faint at the corner." He saw his own handwriting before she spoke. "I followed this," she said. "A clerk said an elderly doctor copied it and mailed it. Said the world needs more decent arrangements than chance. If that was wrong, I'm sorry, and I'll leave when the road opens." Samuel touched the paper. "I never mailed it." Maybe Mercy did. Wind worried the walls. One cow lowed, bored by human plots. He thought of Rosie, of the empty barn at night. Of simple arithmetic, a person in winter. "I'm Samuel Alder," he said. "I don't turn folks out in a storm. Soup first, talk after." He led her along the rope, the lantern a small star wobbling in the white. Rosie opened the door wide and stared at their guest. Heat rolled over Florence like permission. She stood, taking in the plain table and kettle. They ate venison stew and flatbread. Hunger did most of the talking. When Rosie pushed her the larger piece and said, "For you," Florence blinked like she'd been handed a miracle. After, without asking, Florence set out to make small fixes that declare intentions. She trimmed the lamp wick, tapped a loose chair wrung tight, hung her cloak by the stove and stitched its hem with a travel needle. Rosie watched in bright silence. "She can fix things," the girl whispered. "Some things," Florence answered. "Others take time." Night leaned against the windows. Samuel spread a pallet near the stove and laid an extra quilt. "Warmest spot," he said. "Tomorrow we'll see about roads." Florence kept the waxed sleeve in her lap. "Mr. Alder, I won't be a pity case." "I don't offer pity," he said, then gentled it. "I offer respect. You closed my barn better than you found it." Something unknotted in her shoulders. "Respect is fair enough," she said. She slid the letter under the quilt, then warmed her hands at the stove. Samuel banked the fire. Rosie climbed to the loft, each step a small hymn, then peered down. "Is she staying?" "For the storm," he said. Rosie considered. "Neighbors share in winter." Florence smiled. "Then I'll pull my share." Rosie exhaled, finally calm. The house quieted, Wood settling, kettle ticking. In the hush, Samuel felt the old hollowness make room for something slower, like a muscle remembering work. He looked at the shadows the fire drew on the far wall. One tall, one small, and one newly arrived, bent but unbroken, and thought of the letter that had left the beam without his consent and still found its way home. Florence spoke at last, not quite to him. I followed the words because they sounded like a map, not to a man, but to a manner of living. I can go at first light if I misread it. He considered the window blurred white and the rope line trembling like a plucked string. He considered how a house can feel less empty by holding another heartbeat. Morning can choose for us, he said. He blew out the lamp. The storm went on saying what storms say, but inside the little room, the silence had changed shape. It no longer sounded like an absence. It sounded like a beginning. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. Samuel woke to the hush that follows a storm, the kind where the sky is pale but uncertain. The snow settled like judgment. He stoked the fire, careful not to wake Florence, who still lay near the stove with the agency letter clutched beneath her quilt. Rosie had crept down from the loft and now sat cross-legged, watching the woman sleep. She doesn't snore, Rosie whispered. Samuel cracked the stove door, fed it another stick. That's in her favor. Florence stirred, sat up, and blinked against the thin grey light. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and without the storm to half hide her, she looked less like a stranger and more like someone who had simply run out of road. I'll earn breakfast, she said, rising before anyone could object. She found the kettle, poured water, and moved with a kind of practiced economy, as though every borrowed hour came with a debt she intended to pay. Rosie offered her a small tin of salt. Papa doesn't cook with much. Florence smiled at that, soft and grateful. Then we'll change that. Outside, the snow stood waist-high. Samuel hacked a path to the barn, shovel biting into drifts. The cows bawled, restless, and he muttered to them as he spread feed. Yet all the while his mind circled back to the figure in his kitchen, the letter in her hand, the way she'd said Mercy might have mailed it. When he returned, the room smelled of porridge laced with dried apples he hadn't remembered keeping. Rosie and Florence were laughing, Rosie describing how the cow once chased her in the yard. Samuel stopped at the doorframe, boots dripping, and just watched, his daughter's shoulders uncurled, the sound of her voice rising without that shadowed weight. Florence noticed him last. Eat while it's hot. Storm or no storm, men work. Better on full stomachs, he nodded, wary of how natural it sounded. The day passed in chores done two at a time. Florence patched Rosie's skirt where the hem frayed. She wiped the windows clear of frost. By dusk, she had folded herself into the rhythm of the house without asking permission. At supper, Rosie leaned her head against Florence's shoulder, as though she'd known her longer than a day. Samuel's fork paused halfway. Something in his chest pinched, not pain exactly, but the shock of remembering comfort. After the dishes, Florence spoke quietly. I should move on tomorrow. Roads will clear. Rosie's eyes widened. But Samuel set down the tin cup in his hand. Tomorrow we'll see what the roads allow. Winter keeps its own calendar. Florence folded her hands. Mr. Alder, I don't want pity to keep me here. He met her gaze across the lamplight. If I pitied you, I wouldn't hand you chores. That letter you carry, maybe it meant something I didn't know how to finish saying. That doesn't make your presence a burden. For the first time since she'd entered the house, Florence looked unsettled. Not by fear, but by the chance. She might be wanted. That night, Samuel walked out to the porch. The storm had broken clean. Stars blistered the sky, hard and bright. He leaned against the post, breath clouding, and thought of Mary. She had been laughing in a red shawl, sudden, as spring rain. Losing her had taught him the kind of silence that could choke a man. But inside, behind that thin door, another woman tended a girl's bedtime candle and hummed low, tuneless, but steady. Samuel realized that silence no longer owned the house. Days stretched into a rhythm. Florence stayed until the road thawed, though the road seemed stubbornly closed. She and Rosie built small rituals, humming while kneading bread, telling riddles while darning socks. Samuel returned from the barn one evening to find them bent over a page, Rosie sounding out words under Florence's patient finger. "She's quick," Florence said. "She only needed someone to sit still long enough." Samuel's throat caught. Mary had tried, but illness had come too soon. He cleared his voice, nodded. "Rosie's always been sharp." Florence smiled, but her eyes carried a question she did not speak. "And who has been sitting still for you, Samuel Alder?" When Doc Molly arrived the following week, sleigh runners squealing, he stamped snow from his boots and raised his brows at the sight of Florence at the stove. "Well now," he said, "looks like you mailed that letter after all." Samuel stiffened. Florence froze. Rosie giggled. "It found its way here," Samuel said carefully. Doc Molly chuckled, lowering himself into a chair. "Storms deliver more than drifts, I reckon. Man writes words like that. The world conspires to answer." Florence ladled stew, cheeks pink. Samuel felt the weight of unspoken things pressing between them. The letter, the storm, the fragile trust building day by day. That night, when Rosie slept, Florence sat near the fire, needle flashing as she patched Samuel's work gloves. She didn't look up when she said, "I know what people will think. A widow showing up with a letter in her pocket. Some will call it scheming." Samuel leaned against the mantel, eyes on the flame. "Let them talk. Winter teaches what matters. A hand to hold the rope between the house and barn, a voice to teach a girl her letters. That's not scheming. That's life finding a way." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Florence set the gloves down, slow and careful, as though placing something more fragile than leather on the table. The storm had ended, but a different weather had begun to gather between them. The thaw did not come with mercy, only with mud. Snowmelt ran in rivulets down the slope, turning the path between barn and house into a sucking mess. Samuel hauled buckets, boots caked, while Rosie balanced on fence rails, arms out wide. Florence followed, skirts pinned, laughter escaping when she nearly slipped. She caught herself with a hand on Samuel's arm, steadying both of them. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and neither looked away too soon. Inside, Florence hung laundry on lines strung across the kitchen. Rosie chattered at her side, eager to tell stories, how the calf had been born last spring, how the old rooster pecked Samuel's boot. Florence listened with patience rare in adults. Samuel, repairing harness straps at the table, listened without seeming to, noting how easily his daughter's trust had shifted toward this woman who claimed no rights here. That evening, Florence scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees. Samuel frowned. "You don't have to." "I do," she interrupted gently. "Work makes a place yours, at least for a while." By the third week, routine had a new shape. Samuel no longer thought of Florence as a guest. She was simply part of the day. Rosie clung to her hand, walking to the barn. Florence's hum filled the gaps between chores. Yet Samuel wrestled with the quiet fear that when the road cleared, she would vanish, letter or no letter. Doc Molly returned, carrying a satchel and news from town. "Folks are whispering, Sam," he said, sipping coffee at the table. "They've seen the tracks in your yard. A widow shacking up with a rancher. That's how they'll phrase it." "You need to decide before the story grows teeth," Samuel bristled. "She sought shelter, that's all." Florence, standing by the stove, stiffened at the words. "If that's all, I should go." Rosie cried, "No!" and flung herself at Florence's skirts. Doc Molly leaned back, watching Samuel over the rim of his cup. "You wrote a letter once." "Sam, don't wait until she's down the road to remember why." That night, after Rosie's prayers and candles snuffed, Florence stood at the window. The sky spread clean and star-pricked. She spoke low, not turning. "Your doctor friend is right. Gossip can ruin a woman faster than the weather. I can't stay here much longer." Samuel set his hand against the window frame near hers. "And if leaving ruins you worse?" She turned then, face caught between strength and weariness. "I won't be pitied into a home, Samuel Alder. I need to be wanted. Do you understand?" His throat tightened. He did, but the words he needed sat heavy, unready. He only nodded. Florence pulled away, set her quilt by the door as though to remind herself of her freedom. The next morning, Samuel worked the herd until his muscles ached. Every clink of harness, every low from the cattle seemed louder for the silence in his house. When he returned, Rosie sat glumly at the table, Florence folding her few belongings into a worn satchel. "You're leaving?" Rosie's voice quavered. Florence smoothed the girl's hair. "Only until the world settles its tongue, little bird. You'll be fine." Rosie shook her head fiercely. "Not without you." Samuel's chest ached at the sight, his daughter clutching the woman's hand as though trying to anchor her. He opened his mouth, but again the words would not come. Florence lifted her satchel. "I'll wait for Doc Molly's cart. He rides through in 2 days. I can make town from there." Samuel turned away, jaw set, heart hammering against ribs. That evening, Florence sat quietly by the fire, mending socks. Rosie leaned against her, eyes heavy with unshed tears. Samuel studied them both and knew he was standing on the edge of losing something he hadn't known how to name until now. "Florence," he said finally, his voice rough. She looked up, needle poised. "You've done more for this house than I could ask. But I'm a slow man, and grief makes a body slower. If you walk away now, I may not catch up in time." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "Then find your pace, Samuel. I won't stay for less than the truth." That night, when she slept on the pallet, Samuel sat awake at the table. He unrolled the old letter, the one she carried. His own handwriting stared back at him, words he'd written in loneliness, then hidden. He thought of Mary, of promises buried in snow, of Rosie whispering mama in her sleep. When dawn touched the windows, Samuel folded the letter again and tucked it into his coat pocket. He saddled the bay horse and rode toward town, heart set at last. At the ranch, Florence stood on the porch, watching his figure diminish against the horizon. Rosie tugged her hand, anxious. "Where's Papa going?" Florence knelt, brushing hair from the girl's brow. "To fetch something important, I reckon." Inside, the fire crackled, the house both too empty and too full. Florence touched the satchel by the door, but did not pick it up. She stared at the road, knowing a choice was being forged in that space between his leaving and his return. And somewhere deep inside, where fear had lived too long, hope stirred like a seed beneath, thawing ground. The town smelled of smoke and horse sweat, the way all crossroads do when winter thins its grip. Samuel tied his bay outside the general store, snow still clinging to its fetlocks. His mind was a churn of words he had not spoken, promises he meant to, pleas he'd swallowed. He walked straight to the post office, the place where the letter should have gone months ago. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up. "You're older," the clerk said. "Funny thing, that letter of yours, Doc Molly copied it and passed it along. Said he couldn't bear to see decent words buried." Samuel laid a hand on the counter. "Can you write another?" The clerk frowned. "Another? I need it." "Official. Marriage notice. Chapel tomorrow dawn." The boy's pen scratched quickly, amused but respectful. "That'll set tongues wagging." "Let them," Samuel said, voice flat as a hammer strike. Back at the ranch, Florence busied herself with work meant to distract, washing linens, stacking kindling, teaching Rosie another set of letters by firelight. But when the child drifted to sleep, Florence sat alone. Her satchel stayed by the door. Every stitch of her mending seemed pointless if she meant to leave. Still, she patched the worn knees of Rosie's dress, telling herself it was only habit, not longing. She whispered into the quiet, "Don't be a fool, Florence May. Don't wait for what isn't promised." Yet her eyes kept straying to the dark line of road outside. Samuel spent the night in town, slept little, and rose before the horizon bled light. He carried the clerk's paper and a hard-earned resolve. At the chapel, Reverend Tilson blinked in surprise at the request. "You? Sure, Alder? A man ought not bind himself in haste." Samuel's jaw set. "I've wasted too much time already." The Reverend nodded. "Bring her here. God will sort the rest." At the ranch, Florence woke early, startled by the sound of hooves. Samuel rode in, coat frosted, eyes bright with something she couldn't name. He swung down and held out the folded paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Answer," he said simply. She opened it. A marriage notice, signed and stamped. Her knees nearly gave out. "Samuel, you can't mean—" "I do. I should have said it sooner. Not out of pity, Florence, but out of want, out of need. Rosie needs you. I need you. If you'll have me, the chapel waits at dawn." She pressed the paper to her chest, heart thundering. "And if I say no?" His mouth twitched, the barest ghost of a smile. "Then I'll ride you to town myself and watch you leave. But I pray you don't." The hours between stretched taut. Florence braided Rosie's hair with trembling fingers. She mended her own cloak one last time. She told herself to be practical. She had no dowry, no kin to bless the union. But Rosie's small voice calling her Mama in sleep echoed too loudly to ignore. As night fell, Samuel sat whittling by the fire. He carved careful notches, wood shavings to curl. At last, Florence sat across from him. "If I walk into that chapel, Samuel Alder, it will not be for shelter. It will be because I believe you." He met her gaze unflinching. "Then believe me." Dawn came brittle and gold. The three rode into town together, Rosie perched between them. The townsfolk watched, whispers coiling like smoke. But Samuel kept his shoulders square, Florence her chin high. Inside the chapel, Reverend Tilson stood waiting. No flowers, no crowd. Only wood benches, a Bible, and the sound of their boots on the floor. Rosie slipped her hand into Florence's. Samuel's rough palm joined theirs. "Before God and witness," the Reverend said, "two lives join into one." Florence's voice did not falter. "I do," Samuel echoed, steady as stone. "I do," Rosie beamed, whispering, "Now we're a family." The Reverend closed the book. So be it. When they stepped outside, the morning air carried thawing scents, mud, smoke, faint promise of spring. Samuel glanced at Florence, her hair catching sunlight. She smiled, tentative but real. The town might still whisper, but Samuel no longer cared. He had given his answer. Florence had given hers. For the first time in years, the future felt wide as the prairie. The thaw carried whispers faster than any river. By the time Samuel, Florence, and Rosie returned from the chapel, news had already outrun them. At the general store, women paused in their gossip. At the livery, men leaned on shovels, eyes narrowed. Some nodded approval, others only muttered. Samuel ignored them all, but Florence felt the weight of every glance. At home, she folded her cloak over a chair as though setting it down in foreign territory. Rosie twirled circles around the room, chanting, "Mama, Mama, Mama." The word hit Florence's chest like both a blessing and a wound. She smiled, knelt, and hugged the child tight. Samuel watched from the doorway, a man who had built fences all his life, and now wondered how to build something stronger. Trust. For a time, peace held. Florence mended more than clothes. She steadied Rosie's lessons, softened Samuel's silences, filled empty spaces with laughter. When neighbors rode by, they saw smoke curling from the chimney, a woman in the yard shaking rugs, a girl chasing hens. It looked like a family, but not all were content to let it stand. One afternoon, as Samuel repaired a gate, a rider approached, tall, broad, carrying the kind of arrogance that needs no introduction. Florence stepped onto the porch, blood draining from her face. "Eli Graves," she breathed. The man tipped his hat with a smirk. "So it's true. My runaway Florence found herself a rancher." Samuel's grip tightened on the hammer. "State your business." Eli dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Business is simple. Florence is mine. Papers say so. Her late uncle arranged it, the contract sealed. She can't marry another man without my release." Florence's voice rose, steady but fierce. "That contract was fraudulent. I never agreed." Eli shrugged. "Law doesn't care about your say, darling. Only ink." Rosie clung to Florence's skirt, eyes wide. Samuel stepped forward, jaw set. "On my land, you'll mind your tongue. You want to fight in court, take it there. But you don't set foot past this gate again." Eli's smirk deepened. "We'll see what the judge thinks. Don't get too comfortable, Alder. She'll be back with me before the season turns." He mounted, spurred, and rode off in a spray of mud. That evening, Florence sat by the fire, hands trembling in her lap. "He won't stop, Samuel. Eli doesn't know decency. He'll drag us through shame until the law bends his way." Samuel rested a hand over hers. "Then we'll face him straight. You're not alone in this." She searched his face. "But will you still want me if the town believes his lies?" "I don't take my orders from gossip," Samuel said, voice firm. "Or from Eli Graves." Rosie, half asleep, murmured from her pallet, "He can't take Mama." Florence's eyes blurred with tears. She kissed the girl's hair, then looked back at Samuel. For the first time since her arrival, she let herself believe his strength could hold more than cattle and fences. It could hold her. Days grew tense. Word of Eli's claim spread. Some neighbors offered support. Others warned Samuel not to risk trouble. Doc Molly arrived again, pipe clamped in his teeth. "The law can't tangle you 6 ways before you see sense. Best gather proof, Sam, and keep that woman close." Florence lifted her chin. "I won't hide. If Eli wants to drag my name through dirt, he'll have to face me in daylight." Samuel nodded, proud despite the danger. Then daylight it is. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, Samuel found Florence on the porch, cloak wrapped tight. She stared at the horizon where Eli had vanished days before. "Do you regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "The chapel, the vows?" Florence shook her head. "Never, but I fear what he'll cost you." He stepped beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Every choice costs something. You've given Rosie a mother again. You've given me reason to hope. That's worth the fight." She turned then, eyes shining, and for the first time kissed him, brief, fierce, full of all the words neither had spoken. Inside, Rosie stirred and called softly, "Mama?" Florence pulled back, smiling through tears. "She's right, Samuel. Whatever comes, I'm hers now. And yours." The night closed around them, storm-scented, heavy with promise. And thread alike, trouble rides faster than the spring thaw. By the second week after the chapel vows, Samuel's ranch had become a crossroads of gossip. Men at the feed store muttered that Florence May was no better than a schemer. Women at the well whispered that Eli Graves had rightful claim. Samuel ignored them, but the weight pressed like an anvil. Florence met it head-on. She held her chin high in town, kept Rosie close, and went about her work as though every rumor were only dust on the wind. But alone at night, she stared into the fire, lips tight, hands clenched on her sewing, Samuel saw it. He sat near, spoke little, and wished words came easier. The sheriff arrived one gray afternoon, letter in hand. He swung down from his bay horse, boots heavy on the porch. "Got myself a summons," Sheriff Dade said. "Eli Graves filed papers. Claims the marriage contract is binding. Judge'll hear it next week." Florence went pale but straightened. "And if I say no?" The sheriff sighed. "Law wants proof, not feelings. Bring witnesses, bring papers. Otherwise Graves has standing." Samuel's jaw worked. "Then we'll bring truth. Florence is my wife by church and by choice. No paper he waves will undo that." The sheriff tipped his hat, half sympathetic. "See you in court." He left tracks in the mud that looked like warnings. "That night," Rosie whispered, as Florence tucked her in. "He can't take you, can he?" Florence kissed her brow. "Not while I breathe, little bird." Samuel heard from the doorway and felt something shift inside, a vow unspoken but binding. In the days before the hearing, Florence's story spilled out in fragments. How her uncle had promised her to settle the debts. How Eli had cornered her, with talk of contracts and obedience. How she fled west with nothing but a needle case and will to survive. Samuel listened, fists clenched on his knees. "You should have had better men around you," he muttered. Florence laid a hand on his arm. "I have one now." Doc Molly came with advice, pipe smoke trailing. "Contracts can be voided if proved false. Did Eli ever present it before a witness?" Florence shook her head. "He only waved it like a weapon. I never signed." "Then you got a chance," Doc said. "Judge Callahan hates trickery, but Sam," his eyes narrowed, "Graves won't play fair. Be ready." Samuel nodded. "I was born ready." The night before they rode to town, the ranch held a quiet too sharp to rest in. Florence set her satchel by the door, not for leaving but as a reminder of old fear. Samuel watched her, then finally spoke. "I failed you once, Florence. When you asked if I wanted you, I stayed silent too long. I won't again. No judge, no gossip, no Graves will change this. I choose you, every morning, every storm. Do you believe me now?" Her eyes shone wet in lamplight. She reached for his hand, pressed it to her heart. "I believe you." Rosie stirred in the loft and mumbled, "Mama?" Florence smiled through tears. "And I believe her." Dawn came sharp and cold. Samuel hitched the wagon. Florence wore her mended cloak, shoulders squared. Rosie clung to her hand. As they rode toward town, Samuel kept one hand tight on the reins, the other resting over Florence's fingers on the seat. At the courthouse steps, Eli Graves stood waiting, hat tipped low, smirk carved deep. "Brought the little bird to watch." "Did you?" He sneered, eyes flicking toward Rosie. Samuel's voice came like gravel. "Say another word about my daughter and you'll answer outside, not in court." The judge's gavel cracked from within. "Bring them in." Inside, the air smelled of ink and old wood. Judge Callahan leaned heavily on the bench. Eli produced his so-called contract, a stained sheet with bold script and crooked signatures. He flourished it like a weapon. Florence rose, voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "That paper is a fraud. I never put pen to it. My uncle forced his hand and Graves used it as a chain. I fled because I chose freedom over lies." The judge eyed Eli. "Witnesses?" Eli blustered. "Men know my uncle. They'll swear to it." Samuel stood, shoulders broad, voice iron. "I don't argue the ink. I argue the life. Florence is my wife. She stands in my home. She mothers my child. She wears no chain but the one we forged together before God. That paper is nothing but ash compared to the truth." A hush filled the chamber. Even Eli faltered under the weight of it. The judge pounded his gavel. "I'll deliberate. Both parties return tomorrow for a ruling." Outside, townsfolk murmured, eyes sharp with curiosity. Eli mounted, spat in the dirt, and growled at Samuel. "This isn't finished." Samuel's reply came low and final. Yes, it is. Florence gripped his arm, trembling but unbroken. Rosie climbed into her lap on the wagon bench, small arms tight around her waist. As they rode home, the prairie wind cut cold, but inside that wagon, warmth held. Florence whispered, almost to herself, "Whatever the judge says, I've already chosen my place." Samuel glanced at her, heart hammering. "And I've already chosen mine." The night before judgment felt longer than winter itself. At the ranch, silence pressed like a weight. Rosie slept curled against Florence, clutching the quilt tight, while Samuel sat at the table, oil lamp burning low. He sharpened his knife against the whetstone, not because it needed it, but because his hands needed something to do. Florence rose quietly, came to stand beside him. "You don't have to fight the whole world for me, Samuel." He looked up, eyes shadowed. "I don't fight the world. I fight for this house, for my girl, for you." Her throat tightened. She laid her hand over his. For the first time since she'd stepped into his barn, she felt no hesitation. "Then we fight together." Dawn broke cold and brittle. They hitched the wagon, rode into town, and found the square already crowded. Whispers ran ahead of them. Some pitying, some sharp, some curious. Eli Graves stood at the courthouse steps, hat cocked, grin smug. "Come to hear your fate," he sneered. "The judge will see sense today." Samuel's gaze was steady. "The judge will see the truth." Florence kept her chin high, though her stomach churned. Rosie clung to her hand, refusing to let go. Inside, Judge Callahan's gavel cracked. "Case reconvened." Eli stepped forward, waving his paper again. "Contract is binding. No law frees her from it." The judge peered over his spectacles. "Florence May, do you deny the signature?" "I do," she said firmly. "I never signed. My uncle and Eli conspired, but I was never party to it." Samuel rose, voice carrying like a hammer strike. "She is my wife, by vow and by witness. No ink on a page changes that." Eli snorted. "Vows don't stand against law." The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "Perhaps. But fraud does. Not stand against justice. Graves, you have no proof she consented. You claim possession, not partnership." "The court will not enforce a chain forged in deceit." The gavel came down sharply. "Case dismissed. This court recognizes Samuel and Florence Alder as lawfully wed. Graves, any further harassment will be met with a penalty." The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, nods of approval. Eli's face twisted. He shoved past benches, spitting curses. "This ain't over, Alder. I'll see you ruined." Samuel stepped into his path, shoulders squared. "You're finished. Ride out and don't come back." Eli's hand twitched near his belt, but the sheriff moved quicker, laying a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Enough, Graves. You heard the judge." With a final glare, Eli stormed out, boots pounding like gunshots on wood. Outside, the square buzzed. Some shook Samuel's hand, others whispered behind palms, but Florence only heard Rosie's small voice. "Mama, he can't take you now." She knelt, cupped the girl's face. "No, little bird, he never could." Samuel helped her to her feet, his hand lingering at her back. For the first time, Florence let herself lean fully into him. That evening, back at the ranch, the three sat by the fire. Rosie braided scraps of cloth for a doll's dress. Samuel carved wood into a horse. Florence mended, humming under her breath. It felt like a scene stolen from some other life, one she had thought forever lost. She looked at Samuel across the fire. "You stood for me today in front of everyone." "Why?" He set down the carving, met her gaze. "Because I learned something after Mary died. A man can survive alone, but he can't live. You walked into my barn, Florence, and brought life with you. I won't let that slip away." Her chest ached with something larger than fear, larger than gratitude. She whispered, "Then you have me. All of me." Rosie, hearing only pieces, piped up, "Does that mean we're forever?" Florence laughed through tears. "Yes, Rosie, forever." Outside, the prairie stretched dark and endless, but in that small house the storm had passed, and the fire burned steadily. Samuel Alder, once hollow with grief, now held family again, not by chance, not by pity, but by choice. Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, and Rosie nestled between them. For the first time in years, Samuel felt whole. Spring came quietly, but it carried promise on the wind. The snows melted, the creek ran high, and the pasture grass pushed green through the thaw. Samuel walked the fence line each morning with Rosie at his side, Florence waving from the porch. Where once the ranch had echoed with emptiness, now it hummed with life. A child's laughter, the scrape of Florence's broom, the steady rhythm of a man no longer working alone. Neighbors who once whispered, now tipped their hats when they rode. Past, some still muttered behind their hands, but Samuel no longer cared. He had stood before law in town, and Florence had stood beside him. That was enough. One afternoon, Florence sat in the yard teaching Rosie her letters on a slate. Samuel leaned on the rail, listening. Rosie traced clumsy shapes. Florence corrected her gently, patience endless. The girl looked up and grinned. "Mama, I did it!" Florence froze, tears springing suddenly. Samuel caught her gaze, steady as the earth beneath them. She bent, kissed Rosie's crown and whispered, "Yes, little bird, you did!" Samuel's heart swelled at the sight. He thought of the letter he had hidden away, words he never sent, and how somehow they had found their way back to him in flesh and blood. That night, Doc Molly came by, chewing his pipe stem. He watched Florence stir the stew at the hearth and Rosie chatter at Samuel's side. "Looks like that letter did its work after all," he said. Samuel chuckled low. "Didn't know words on paper could build a home." Doc tapped ash from his pipe. "Words can't. People can. And you found the right ones." Florence smiled shyly, cheeks flushed from the fire. But not all memories vanished with the winter. One evening, Florence confessed in quiet, "Eli may be gone, but the fear he planted isn't. I wake sometimes expecting him at the door." Samuel took her hands, rough and scarred. "He won't come back. And if he does, he'll face me first. You're safe here, Florence, with us." She searched his eyes and saw no hesitation, only truth. She lay her head against his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart. "Then this is home," she whispered. Spring deepened. The barn filled with calves bawling for their mothers, Rosie chasing chickens with shrieks of delight. Florence planted herbs by the kitchen door, kneeling in the dirt with sleeves rolled. Samuel watched her, struck by the simple rightness of it, the kind of sight he once thought lost forever. At supper, Rosie bowed her head, small voice earnest. "Thank you for Mama and for Papa and for not being alone." Florence's eyes shone. Samuel's throat tightened. He reached across the table, caught Florence's hand, and held it firm. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the prairie, Samuel and Florence walked the fence line together. Rosie skipped ahead, chasing fireflies. Samuel spoke low. "When Mary died, I thought love ended with her. I was wrong. It waited. For you." Florence's breath caught. She squeezed his hand. "And I thought I'd never be more than someone else's burden. But you showed me I could belong." They stopped, watching Rosie whirl in the fading light, laughter rising like a hymn. Samuel bent, kissed Florence's brow. "We're not a half family anymore. We're whole." The story closed not with gunfire or grief, but with the steady warmth of chosen family. A widower, a weary traveler, and a child found their way through storm and trial into something stronger than survival. Love earned, tested, and true. And if the prairie wind carried whispers, let them whisper. For in the older house, there was laughter by the fire, bread on the table, and hands clasped tight against whatever storms tomorrow might bring. From an empty barn to a full home, from a letter unsent to vows spoken, Samuel Alder and Florence May built a life the frontier could not tear down. Their story is a reminder. Sometimes love doesn't arrive on a white horse, but on weary feet, carrying scars. And when it does, it remakes the world. If this tale stirred your heart, ride with us again. Subscribe, share, and keep the trail alive.